Hello. How are you guys doing today? Ready to get into a spine-chilling experience with 3 all-time best true scary stories from Reddit? If you're a fan of terrifying tales that keep you up at night, then you're in for a treat. We've scoured Reddit to bring you the most bone-chilling, hair-raising true stories that will have you double-checking your locks and peering into the shadows. Our first story, The Horror on Hawthorn Drive, takes us into the unsettling world of a childhood home filled with an oppressive, sinister presence. As the narrator grows up, the malevolent force only grows stronger, leading to a horrifying revelation that will haunt your dreams. Next, in The Man with My Voice, we follow the life of a solitary data entry worker whose peace is shattered by a mysterious delivery man. What starts as an ordinary night turns into a nightmare as he discovers that his voice has been stolen, leaving him in a state of silent terror. Finally, we bring you The Thin Line of Hope, a deeply unsettling account of a young man's struggle with weight loss. Desperate for a solution, he signs up for a health program that promises miraculous results. But as he soon discovers, the price for his ideal physique is far more horrifying than he ever imagined. So, sit back, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for these 3 all-time best true scary stories from Reddit. And if you enjoy the chills and thrills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling content. Your support helps us bring you the best in horror and keep the scares coming. So without further ado, let's dive in now.
Story 1. The Horror on Hawthorn Drive.
I think I was around 6 years old when I started to notice something felt unusual about our family home. My parents told me we had moved when I was a baby, so it's been the only place I recall as being home, but it never quite felt right. I would go to friends' homes after school or at weekends for birthday parties, and the atmosphere just felt so different in comparison to when I was home. There hung an air of what I would describe as oppressive malevolence in our home, but as a child it felt like fear, and I remember trying to articulate this cloying, crushing, almost sinister presence to my parents all those years ago, but it was casually disregarded as an overstimulated child's imagination. As I grew older, I felt a greater sense of unease at home and found myself staying out with friends, doing whatever I could to prolong my time away before I had to come back. The feeling of anxiety and paranoia would rise back to the surface the closer I got to home. You see, it felt like I was being watched, like there was something in the home monitoring my every action. This wasn't a, oh my parents could walk in at any moment, teenager level of paranoia. No, this was hairs standing on end, goosebumps, fight or flight instincts kicking into overdrive. As if my body and mind were sounding the alarm to get out, run. But after searching every room on several occasions, there was never anything out of place. I continued to raise my concerns with my parents, but it fell on deaf ears. They chalked it up to me, acting out as teenagers typically do. They had bigger issues. As I could see the cracks starting to show in their marriage, eventually becoming all-encompassing, as arguments ruptured around the home and their relationship began to crumble, all while the ever-present feeling of malevolence continued to hang in the air. As time went on, their relationship completely broke down. My mother had become a recluse, quit her job, and spent most days locked away in the spare room, only emerging to get food, with barely an acknowledgement to mine or my father's existence. My father had become bitter and distant, a hollow shell of his former self, except for the infrequent outbursts of emotion, swaying from anger to desperate pleading whenever he and my mother crossed paths in the kitchen. The strange thing is, during this time, the house felt almost normal. The dread and paranoia I'd felt before had almost disappeared, but had been replaced by the anguish that comes with being in the middle of a family falling apart. It didn't last too long though, as my mother stopped emerging from the spare room entirely, and the silence in the house was frequently punctuated with the thunderous knocks of my father's fists on the spare room door, followed by his pleas for my mother to come out and eat, then the sorrowful sobbing of a broken man heading back to his room. I hated it. I hated being in the middle of it all, and seeing the people I loved, my parents, my world, crumbling away, all while I wasn't even pinging on their radar. I felt invisible. In such a short space of time, my father had become completely despondent, barely registering my presence despite my protests. My mother hadn't been seen for days, and he had stopped knocking on her door. I tried knocking myself, pleading with her to come out and eat, but was met with silence each time. After several attempts across multiple days, my father screamed at me to leave her alone. 1 week had passed, and it felt like time had come to a standstill in the house. My father stopped going to work and, like my mother, had started to confine himself to his bedroom. The air felt stagnant, and the silence was almost suffocating. I spent a lot of time out of the house seeking solace in my friends and their families, too ashamed to admit what was going on at home, diverting questions over lunch to other topics of conversation. I was not prepared for the 8th day. I woke up in the middle of the night and immediately felt it, the rising dread, the pervasive feeling of being watched. My throat tightened and my pulse began to quicken as the fear grasped my mind like an iron vice. I felt like I was 6 again, unable to truly convey and comprehend the internal terror I was going through, my fight or flight instinct screaming. I tried to force the feelings back and put my pillow over my head, but my mind was racing, and the surging feeling that something sinister didn't want me to sleep was destroying any chance of me getting rest. I decided to get up and see if going outside would help clear my mind. It was only after I climbed out of bed and my eyes had adjusted to the darkness that I noticed the smell. There was a rancid, foul stench in the air, like rotting food left out in the sun to fester in the heat. I accidentally took a breath, and the smell clung in my throat, causing me to cough and retch in disgust. I grabbed a nearby shirt and put it over my mouth and nose to act like a makeshift mask, but it was of minimal effect against the invasive stench. I went into the hallway to see if I could try and figure out the source of the foul odor, and noticed the doors to both the spare room and my parents' room were open. I yelled my parents' names into the darkness, but was met with silence. So I cautiously walked down the hallway to the spare room first to see if my mother was still there, and simply was in a deep sleep. As I got closer to the room, my hair began to stand on end as the feeling of dread became more and more intense. I reached the doorway, peered into the dark, and was hit with an even more intense odor. Rotten food? No, rotten flesh. I reached for the light switch, fumbling in the darkness to find it. Half choking on the smell which was seeping through my makeshift mask, I managed to find the switch, and the room was bathed in light, illuminating the true horror before me. She, my mother, was in the wall. Her body had become fused with the wall of the house, contorted and crumpled as if she was being slowly devoured. Her face and what remaining limbs could be seen protruding were gaunt and pale, her cheeks sunken and eyes hollow as if all moisture had been drawn from her. Her face held an expression of pure anguish, misshapen and stretched into a ghastly visage, violently screaming without the sound. Tears clouded my view as I fell back into the hallway, and a wave of nausea hit me. My mind couldn't comprehend the horror I just saw. That was my mother, who only a few days before was fine. But now, I righted myself, pushing back my unraveling thoughts, and tried to regain my composure. Whatever happened here was not natural, and the being or entity that caused it may still be present. A chill ran down my spine as the next thought slipped into my mind: Father. I turned around and walked further down the hallway to my parents' bedroom, and was met with the same disgusting smell. My heart sank as I reached for the light switch. He was on the floor, but only half his body was visible, for anything below his waist was scattered in the walls. I looked up to the ceiling and saw viscera and rotten flesh poking out of cracks above. What was once a magnolia room was covered in dark red and brown stains, with scraps of flesh and shards of bone poking out of the walls. His neck was craned at an inhuman angle, forcing his head to look towards the ceiling, and like my mother, he was holding an expression of pure, contorted agony. My mind was on the brink of collapse. I turned to leave the room when I saw he had one outstretched arm which appeared to be pointing to something on the floor. I looked over from the doorway, paralyzed with fear and unable to convince my body to move closer, but managed to make out what looked like a message scratched into the floor under his bloody fingernails: "Burn it all before it feeds." I didn't have to be told twice. Adrenaline surged through my body, shaking me free from shackles of fear and driving me into action. I rushed back out into the hallway and headed downstairs to the kitchen. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt heavy, and the feeling of being watched became ever more pervasive. My heart was racing, and I could swear I could see the walls rippling and undulating, but each time my eyes tried to focus on a particular point, all I could see was darkness. It felt like whatever this entity was, it was becoming aware of my plans, and as I reached the kitchen, my body started to slow down. I was feeling drained, both emotionally and physically, my mind crumpling under the stress and all I had seen. My body fighting back the waves of nausea and the cycles of adrenaline surging and dumping, causing my muscles to cramp. Through my addled mind, it was starting to make sense. Whatever this thing was, it influenced and fed on emotions, breaking people down enough to feed on them physically, and I was running out of energy and time. I took advantage of another wave of adrenaline and ran to a kitchen drawer, frantically fumbling in the dark until my hand clasped round a box of matches. I struck several matches, setting fire to the curtains above the kitchen sink. The flames began to slowly crawl up the curtains and spread to the nearby cabinets on the wall. A blood-curdling shriek reverberated around the house as the flames started to engulf the walls and smoke plumed across the kitchen ceiling. The walls started to pulsate violently, and I could hear the foundations creaking and feel it rumbling beneath my feet. The shriek kicked my fight and flight drive fully into flight, and I ran out the kitchen into the main hall towards the door. The walls shook more violently the closer I got to the door, in the mix of smoke and rancid, rotten flesh caught in my throat, making me almost vomit, but I managed to compose myself and reached the front door. My hand was on the handle when I heard a voice from behind me. "Where are you going, my love? It's late and your father needs you." My mind nearly faltered, but I pushed the door open and ran outside to hear a scream of anger erupt from the house. Whatever this being was, it wanted me to stay and perish with it, but I ran down the street and didn't look back. My life as I knew it was over, and I had to start again somewhere new. After all, who would believe me if I told them what happened that night? I still get nightmares about what happened several years later. I looked online at the local newspapers, and it was determined to be a horrible accident. A tragic house fire killed a family of 3 with no suspected foul play. The emergency services who attended the scene couldn't recover all the bones of the bodies, but had chalked it up to the remains being scattered and buried in the debris as the house collapsed in the fire. The reason I've wrote all this is to serve as a warning. If you ever visit somewhere and you don't feel right, like someone is watching you and your brain and body are screaming out telling you to run, listen before it's too late.
Story 2. The Man with My Voice.
I have been living alone for the last 2 years. Fresh out of college, I got a very stable and very isolating job in work-from-home data entry for a large medical company out west. I have always been a keep-to-myself kind of person, and I never really had any friends that didn't last through the next grade or semester. I just never found myself as someone who got much out of long-term company and interaction. I had plenty of so-called friends drop me when they moved to different states and cut all contact. These experiences of having someone and then losing them have turned me off from friendships and relationships altogether. I know it's not healthy for me, but at the end of the day, I always find comfort in knowing that I always have myself to keep me company. I found a great third-floor apartment near where I went to school, and being very familiar with the area after 4 years moved myself in from my dorm with no trouble. Remote work from home in my field has many benefits. Usually just a super simple population of data on spreadsheets or systems of medical data and records. No meetings or calls daily, nor reason to ever be on a mic or camera. Due to its sensitivity, it pays very well, and I have made myself a good and simple, albeit quiet life post-grad. Everything my loner self could have dreamed of. One thing you start to notice when you live alone is how few times a day, or even a week, you actually talk or even say anything. I had no co-workers, roommates, or even pets to talk to, and sometimes would find myself going entire days without speaking a word. I didn't tend to go out and would spend my nights gaming or reading, or in a silent workout at the gym. It is a strangely peaceful existence not having to talk or hold any conversations. When I would talk at a restaurant, to the doctor, or to my mom on one of her monthly calls, I would often have an odd experience hearing my voice, as if it was the voice of another being projected through me. Usually, just an odd feeling to shake off, like how it feels to eat food you have not eaten for a while, a sensory adjustment to the now changed world around me. This had never been something I had dwelt on in the past, as usually, I would go a day or two before eventually having to talk. never really thinking of it as a disturbing or unusual experience. That was until last night. I never typically ordered in food, but I had done so today after a busy day in systems and spreadsheets. I caved and ordered some pizza from a nearby restaurant online through a delivery app and had it delivered to my door. I always selected the no contact or leave at door option. Chalk it up to my growing antisocial personality, but if I could minimize any human interaction and maintain my almost monastic vow of silence, it was a win for me. As I pushed back onto my living room couch, I waited for my food, which was to arrive in a few minutes. This peace was shattered by a firm but gentle knock on my door. Odd, I thought to myself as I checked the leave at door option, but mistakes happen. I was not pressed over it at all, especially as someone who had driven for a similar delivery app during the pandemic. As I approached the door, I was greeted by a perfectly normal-looking, ordinary taller brown-haired man who smiled and handed the box to me. He said the following in a carefree and airy tone of voice. "Have a good rest of your night and enjoy, sir. Looking forward to hearing from you soon." I crinkled my nose at the last part, but took the box and nodded to him, curtly saying thank you while shutting the door. I noticed he stood outside my door for about 5 seconds before walking away and whistling a tune to himself. At the time I assumed he just expected a good review, which I gave him on the app, but something about that "hearing from you soon" didn't quite sit right with me. I am beginning to realize what he might have meant. The rest of the evening went off without a note. I devoured the pizza and went to throw the box away. It was at this point I noticed the top of the pizza box had been cut into a few times by what I assumed was the knife or slicer at the restaurant, but it looked off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it looked less like random cuts and more like deliberate attempts to write. I could make out no recognizable words and symbols, so I took the benefit of the doubt and threw the box out. I took a shower and went to bed with nothing amiss. That all changed this morning. I was woken up that next day by a phone call, which would have been a cause for alarm, but it was from my mom, one of her usual monthly check-in calls. I picked up the phone and spoke into it. "Hey, Mom," or at least I attempted to speak that into it. Instead, all that came out of my throat was a dusty and almost wind-like shrill into the receiver. I attempted to clear my throat, chalking it up to just waking up, and tried again. Nothing. Every time I tried to speak, the only sound that could be heard was a shrill and guttural rushing noise that sounded and felt like a dagger to my lungs, like as if they had been penetrated with a knife, and only the rushing sound of air out of them could be heard as I attempted to speak. My mom said my name several times, and eventually hung up as I frantically tried to speak. I ended up texting her and lying, saying I was doing well and was having tech issues but would call her later. I tried looking at my mouth and throat in a mirror and saw nothing amiss. Tried drinking water and making tea with honey, but there was nothing I could do to get my voice back. Eating and swallowing were perfectly normal, but I could not speak no matter how hard I tried. A bit panicked, I found a doctor who was open on the weekend and grabbed my keys to hop into my car to race there as fast as I could. I hoped it wouldn't be any trouble that I had not called before. Obviously I couldn't with my lack of voice. As I opened the door to run to my car, I was stopped dead in my tracks, faced with the same man who had delivered my food to me yesterday. As I opened my mouth to shout in surprise, I heard a voice. "Told you I would be hearing from you soon." It was not the shrill and nasally voice I had heard yesterday when the food was dropped off. No, it was my voice, crawling its way from his lips through the wry smile he wore on his face. He gave me a wink and walked out towards the stairs leading down from my apartment, leaving me standing in the front door in horror of what I had seen and heard. It was at this point that I realized I had not lost my voice. It had been taken from me. Somehow this thing I took for granted had been stolen from me. I don't think any doctors are going to be able to help me. I do not know what I can do. Someone else has my voice.
Story 3. The Thin Line of Hope.
My mom keeps a scrapbook of photos holding several memories. Every photo that I was in followed the same pattern, at least until I turned 22. In these memories, I would be in the backyard running around with Trevor with my shirt off. Trevor is our family pit bull. Thank you very much. My body devoid of fat or muscles would expose the outline of my ribs. My arms would dangle by my hips, and my grin in need of braces would present no charm. All the way up till my third semester at community college. I thought I would have this exact physique until I died. Christ, do I now wish I could have still lived out that past insecurity. My usual school appetite of zero sugar Gatorade and a side of apple slices had ceased a bit. I didn't suddenly have an epiphany where I looked down at my hollow exterior and realized that I should start putting more food in my system from then on. Nothing like that at all. My mother had called me. The things she said, her voice. God, it was a cry that sent a shockwave through my body. At around 2 p.m., my father had a heart attack. Tragic, but it hadn't been unexpected. Like what my body would later become, he too was a heavy individual. He spent most of his last few years on Earth breathing through an oxygen mask while he sat in a wheelchair on the backyard deck. After I had watched the man, my childhood hero, eat himself to death, lowered 6 feet under within a casket as my mom and I cried our souls out, it would have been the best time to use it as motivation to hit the gym. This hadn't occurred. Weeks after the funeral, I spent countless of checks at nearby fast food joints. The passenger seat of my car had filled up with empty food bags, wrappers, and several unfinished cups of vanilla-flavored coffee drinks. Don't even get me started on the piss bottles underneath my bed. With all of this, others thought of me as a lazy and heavy individual. What killed me was that they were right. I wouldn't stand in front of the mirror and look at my body and feel proud. I just couldn't. After I clocked out from one of my shifts during the late afternoon, I had passed a local burger joint on my way home. For once, a spark of willpower had shined deep within me. I drove past the location and had congratulated myself when I pulled up to my childhood home. That hadn't lasted long. When night came, I drove back to the place and feasted down on 2 double-doubles with a side of chili cheese fries. It embarrasses me to admit it, but I spent the next 2 minutes sobbing alone in my car as I finished the second burger. Humiliation over my weight hurt like fire. Unfortunately, comfort food didn't seem to hurt until it went down my throat. A few days later, I had received an ad on my laptop about a health program. I had been scratching Trevor's belly as I spent my time browsing random YouTube videos. That was when it popped on the right side of the screen. It had been a website that involved a program that specialized in healthier lifestyles. Yet, the company presented a routine where you could eat all you want. You wouldn't have to cut out all of the good, unhealthy stuff from your diet. You didn't even have to work out. As much as I would love to say that my future downfall would be for not reading the entire agreement of the website, that had not been the reason. Aside from the no diet or exercise for weight loss, I hadn't noticed any red flags regarding the program. I typed out my information on the contact form below and didn't hear anything for 2 days. That's when I got the call. A woman with a friendly voice had spoken on the other end. She set up a time and a date for when I could stop by the location. May 7th. When I arrived at the building, I noticed that the parking lot had been entirely filled up. I ended up parking at a local hiking trail on the other side of the street. When I made my way towards the location, a 3-story bricked building surrounded by spruce tress, I took note of the vehicles. While some of them appeared okay when it came to cleanliness, others had not. They were covered in thick coats of dust, along with the several dried and white droppings of bird shit. When I entered the building, I filled out a form at the front desk, and a male worker in scrubs wrote me a room number, 213. I found the room after going up to the second floor. I'm surprised I hadn't taken note of how isolated the place felt. There was also a loud flushing sound from beyond the walls. It was the kind of noise you'd hear behind the door of a public restroom when you walked by. I found the room and waited inside. The pictures on the walls made me turn away and gag as soon as I realized what they were. There were several photographs of hands holding the removed and gold-like fat from patients. For some, it may have been motivating. For me, I was ready to lose my lunch. It hadn't been long until a thin woman with dyed blue hair entered the room and smiled. We talked for a bit about my weight, what was in my usual diet, and if I had always been this particular weight. She then took a file off a nearby table and pulled out a trio of photos. The first image showed a brown and box-like metallic belt. There were a pair of large and white tubes sticking out from both sides, and in the middle was what looked like a clear and round glass casing. The second photo had been of an obese man standing behind a brown backdrop, presumably around 300 pounds. If I didn't stop eating what I ate, I might have ended up looking like him. The third and final photo had been the same man. This time, he had slimmed down, and was even putting on muscle. The female worker smiled and told me that the man hadn't worked out or changed his diet at all. What shocked me even more was when she told me that his eating habits had become worse, and yet he still had what I considered the ideal male physique. The woman told me the machine was a device that helped suppress the weight of the patients in the facility. I didn't have to hear anything else. It was unintelligent of me to not ask any other questions. Yet that fantasy, my old body, maybe even one that was better than before, it sounded wonderful. The worker opened the door, and we went down the hall and into a room through a pair of yellow and metallic doors. There was a chair and a metal table off to the right. There, the device sat. I also took notice of a brown door connected to the room. It didn't matter then. All I wanted was the damn weight to go away. The woman asked for me to remove my shirt, and she sat me down in the chair and began to set up the device. She hooked up the belt from the machine around my waist. I closed my eyes and began to cry a little. This had to work. Earlier, I had thought about stopping my vehicle and go back home and forget the entire program. For all I knew, they could have just been a group of scammers that wanted to harvest my organs. No, I needed this. This fantasy had to become true. If I opened my eyes a little quicker, I would have noticed the woman pointing a syringe towards my neck. I had woken up in a dazed state. The lights had been on in the large room, and yet my surroundings weren't the first thing I noticed. The aroma stung my nostrils. It was like I had been thrown into a non-working trash compactor. No crushing at all, only the smell of waste. I retched so hard that I felt a migraine coming along. That's when I saw the other patients. From all around, there were several men and women, all of different ages. They were strapped down in metallic chairs. They too had been wearing the same contraption I had around my waist. Their weight had grown far beyond from what a living person could take. Incisions had been made just above their hips, and those tubes from the machines had been forced within the cuts. A fluid of yellow, red, and brown was being sucked out of their bodies and disposed from within the belt-like machine, then down holes embedded in the ground in front of their seats. There had also been metal buckets placed below their exposed buttocks. That's when I realized the smell had not been garbage and waste, but excrement. Some of patients' bodies hadn't been heavy at all. Loose skin from their faces and limbs hung below the chairs, and it continued on a bit before stopping at their shoes. On the other end of the room, there was that same brown door. Nurses came in and out carrying large trays of fast food, desserts, and several packs of soda cans. The first thing I thought would happen was that the patients would knock the food out of the workers' hands and use the remaining energy they had to break out of their prison. Instead, they only looked up at the nurses without saying anything and began to grab at the food before stuffing it into their mouths and barely chewing. There had been that vacuum sound, the one that I heard beyond the walls from earlier. The machines had turned on, and the suction of the tubes began. Groans echoed throughout the room. I heard someone to the right throw their head forward and vomit. I looked down at my body. Like everyone else, incisions had been made just above my hips where those tubes had been placed. These people, the owners of those dust-covered vehicles, they didn't seem like they wanted to leave. Had they been here for months? Stuffing their faces, having these meals and fat pumped out of their body after it hit their stomachs? I pictured my future, the despair of my mom as she wondered where I had gone. Even if she found my car outside this building in the future, it would be too late for when she came back with a bunch of armed policemen. Would she find my body either heavier than she had ever seen me or any other human, or twig thin with all my excess skin hanging all the way to the floor? What if I too accepted this life and decided to enjoy the rubbish these workers would continue to feed me until my heart would give out? It's sad to note that most of these things later happened. Months later, my mom had tracked down the location, and the building had been swarmed to the brim with a SWAT team and cruisers. They had found my body near death, frail with loose skin that stretched on. Although all of this happened so long ago, I still can't think about it without wanting to burst into tears. I've been a part of a rehabilitation center for a while now. After everything that I went through, my body will never become the ideal figure that I've always wanted to have. Writing all of this down helped a little, thankfully. I might show it all to my psychologist tomorrow morning. If I did indeed present it to them, I'll probably post this online as well. If anyone on Reddit or Facebook is reading this right now, I hope that you can all look past the grotesque aspect of my life story. If any of you have been struggling with weight insecurities, I hope that you'll be kinder to yourselves. Don't let it drag you down. If you do want to get into better shape, I shall cheer you on. My mom's mental health has been improving since then, and if I'm lucky enough, I can come back home and start up community college again. The next thing I'm hoping to work on is letting go of that facility. Despite all the pain I went through, I sometimes have this urge to look up that website and find another location.
Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to listen to similar stories in future.